What if I told you that there was a simple, straightforward equation that not only predicts how likely you are to procrastinate, but also by manipulating the variables shows you how you can overcome procrastination? I know it sounds weird. I was quite surprised myself when I heard about it, but you know what? It's out there and it works. So in this episode of 80/20 Productivity, let's talk about the procrastination equation and how you can use it to solve your procrastination. So the procrastination equation is the work of Dr. Piers Steele out of the University of Calgary. He writes extensively on this concept of an equation for procrastination, both in his research paper, which was a meta-analysis on the procrastination literature, and his excellent book, which I highly recommend, also called The Procrastination Equation. We're going to pull on those resources for this episode, and we're also going to pull on some of the research I've done in goal setting and also some of the experiences I've had with clients working on overcoming procrastination. So let's get into it. Right off the bat, what is the procrastination equation itself? I'll give you the equation as it stands, and then we'll break down each of the components, the variables in the equation, and then we'll show how to solve for each of those variables. Right. So the procrastination equation is simply this: U equals E times V over D times I. U equals E times V over D times I. What does that even mean? Well, let's define those. U is utility, E is expectancy, V is value, D is delay, and I is impulsiveness. But before we get into the actual equation in terms of what those things actually mean and how we can solve for them, I think it's worth taking a few seconds to quickly define what procrastination is and the cost of procrastination. If you're listening to this or watching this episode, you probably already know exactly what procrastination is. At least you understand the concept of it. Otherwise, why are you watching this? You're probably trying to overcome procrastination. But I do want to give us a functional definition of it. And also the cost of procrastination. Procrastination costs us a lot. Some people actually watched a video recently on YouTube about somebody claiming procrastination as their superpower. And after listening to the video, I wasn't entirely sold on the argument for it. It seemed to make the argument that they procrastinate, and then at the end, when the deadline looms closer, they can get hyper-focused and put out a ton of work with very high quality, high value work in a short time. That was the argument. I don't recommend that approach. I think procrastination is something that is ultimately negative, especially if you're doing it, as the definition will show us, without any kind of strategy. In fact, if you were strategizing with procrastination, it's technically not procrastination anymore. It's just good old-fashioned delay. But the functional definition of procrastination, according to the research paper by Dr. Piers Steele, and I strongly agree with this, is procrastination is delaying a task in spite of being aware that you will be worse off for delaying that task. So delaying or just not completing a task, I should say, in spite of knowing full well that you'll be worse off. In other words, there's a gap between what you want to do and what you're actually doing. You put it off. So in that sense, procrastination is not great. Not only does it cause a lot of stress for the person procrastinating, it also impacts the quality of the work, because I don't care what anybody says. If you had a little bit more time to do something, you would probably put out better quality. I'm not saying, give yourself 10 times the amount of time you need to do something, but give yourself enough time to do it. And then when the time comes to do it, actually do it so that you can produce the quality of work that you intend or desire to produce. So that's a quick refresher on procrastination. I actually have another episode here on the channel or on the podcast here where I talk about reasons why you're procrastinating, 5 reasons that have nothing to do with laziness. So if you want to check that out either before or after this episode, you're welcome to do so. But let's dive into this today's topic, which is the procrastination equation, right? So going back to our definition here, you have U equals E times V over D times I. What are these components? What are these variables? What do they mean? What do they stand for? All right. First of all, let's quickly look at U. U is utility. Now, according to Dr. Piers Steele's research, and according to his book as well, the language he's chosen here is utility. Utility is literally the value that determines whether or not you're going to procrastinate something. Any task that is high in utility will not likely be procrastinated. I'm not sure why they use the word utility here. I would have said maybe desirableness or something else. But when we get into the other variables, you'll see why. But the main thing to keep in mind is a high utility task or endeavor will not be procrastinated. In other words, it relates inversely with procrastination. For example, people who play video games, for example, instead of doing their work, for them, the video game has higher utility, at least in that moment, as we'll see later on, than doing maybe the more boring task of maybe preparing a budget for the office or something, or doing their homework or whatever the case may be. Utility is what we're after. We want high utility for the task. And if the utility of a task is low, according to the procrastination equation, the odds that you do that task is also low. So U is utility. Let's get into the other variables. E. Remember, E is expectancy. Let's define expectancy. Expectancy, according to this equation, means the odds, basically, that you will succeed at the task. It's that simple. Your expectation of success in the task. So if you expect to do well in a given task, that means your expectancy is high. If you expect to not do so great at a task, then your expectancy is low. In the book, The Procrastination Equation, Dr. Steele gives an example of a salesperson who has had a rough time of his sales calls or his sales outreaches. And so now he's kind of jaded. He doesn't really expect to do well. And so he procrastinates making the sales calls because he has a low expectancy of success in those sales calls. This might be a cause of procrastination for you. If there's a certain kind of task that you find yourself procrastinating a lot, maybe unconsciously you have low expectancy of success for it. So that's one thing to consider. We'll tie all these together later on in the episode, but this is the first variable in the equation is expectancy. Now, if you remember what the equation looked like before, it was U equals E times V, so EV over DI, D times I. Looking at this top part here, the numerator, the higher the numerator, obviously the higher your utility and the less likely that you procrastinate. However, the higher the denominator, the product of D and I, then the lower the odds, the utility, and the lower the odds that you will do the task. This is important to keep in mind. We want EV, the numerator, as high as possible, right? We want this as high as possible. And then we want DI to be as low as possible so that the value of U is high. And that way we don't procrastinate. Let's now talk about V. V stands for value. Now, value is another one that is defined in an interesting way, both in the research and also in the book, The Procrastination Equation. Value simply means, how much you value the task. But keep in mind here that value is more than just economic value. I know here on the 80/20 Productivity podcast, we often talk about creating value. We talk about high value activities. We talk about high value effort and so on. Value and effort. That's kind of how we talk about 80/20. The least amount of effort for the highest amount of value. In the sense of procrastination, however, value just means what you value. So if you value excitement, a boring task will carry low value for you. What does this look like for you? It might mean that you are unconsciously, again, procrastinating on something because it doesn't provide value to you. Remember, value might be monetary or not, if you value social interactions a lot and there's a particular activity that does not feed that for you, maybe it even takes you away from it, then that task will have low value. So value is a big one. I mean, they're all big ones, but we'll get a little bit deeper into it when we start talking about how to solve these variables. So how do you increase or improve expectancy? How do you increase or improve value, and the other components as well? But for now, let's look at the definition. Value simply is, does this task deliver more or a reasonable amount of something that you value, whether tangible or intangible? All right. The next is D, and D stands for delay. Delay. Remember, D is part of the denominator, right? So we want D and I to be low so that U can be high. Utility can be high. In other words, the probability that you do the task. So D stands for delay. What does this mean? Quite simply, and this is a big part of the framework that Dr. Steele provides, is the temporal dimension, temporal regarding time. The further away a task is, the further away the deadline for a task is, the more likely you are to procrastinate it. That's why D is at the bottom here. If D is large, utility goes down and you are more likely to procrastinate. Delay also can mean delay in feedback. So keep that in mind as we get into this. Delay is not just the delay of completion. It could also be the delay of feedback, the delay of payoff. That becomes important when you start looking at not only how far away the outcome of a task is, but how soon can you get feedback on it? One of the examples that Dr. Steele gives in the book is the example of college students who have essays, right? An essay is often due, or a term paper, literally term paper. It's due usually at the end of the term or sometime late in the term. You don't get feedback on the paper until the end of the term. But meanwhile, you're expected to do all this work over the course of the semester or the term to complete the paper. So it's no surprise that utility might be low, and college students, notoriously procrastinate writing their term papers, because between the time they get the term paper and the time they're supposed to hand it in, there are so many other things they could be doing that provide instant feedback. Granted, those things might be more fun as well, but the main focus for us right now is the further away a task is due, and especially if the feedback for that task is also further away, the more likely you are to procrastinate it, the lower its utility. So that's D. So we've talked about E and V. We've talked about D being delay, and now let's talk about I. I is impulsiveness. So impulsiveness is a character trait, isn't it, of the person. The more impulsive a person is, the less likely they are to harness the executive function they need to overcome distraction and focus on the task that they're procrastinating. This is a big one. In fact, impulsiveness as a trait correlates incredibly strongly with procrastination. The more impulsive a person is, the more likely they are to procrastinate, period. Not just because they don't want to do the task, interestingly, but because they are often distracted by many other tasks around them, which we'll see when we get into the interventions, the ways of overcoming procrastination. But there you have it. This is the entire equation. Again, it's the equation of U, which is utility, which is the likelihood that you will do the task because it has high utility. U is equal to E for expectancy, right, times V for value over delay times impulsiveness. And that is the procrastination equation by Dr. Piers Steele. Now let's get into some practical applications of the procrastination equation. and how it might help you overcome procrastination. Before we go on, let's quickly talk about today's episode sponsor, which is Magic Mind. Magic Mind is a nootropic drink. It's a small 2-ounce productivity shot packed full of nootropic agents that boost your brain's it boosts your cognitive abilities, boosts your brain's ability to function, provides energy, staves off fatigue. I personally use Magic Mind as part of my morning ritual, and it has some components in there that have been linked to overcoming procrastination. For example, L-theanine has been shown to elevate mood, and there is a correlation between being in a poor mood and procrastination. Rhodiola rosea and Bacopa monnieri have been shown to boost certain aspects of cognitive function that help with executive decision making, which is obviously important for overcoming temptation and distractions and doing the things that matter. There are a lot more cognitive and immune system functions that Magic Mind helps with. The best way to find out is to try Magic Mind for yourself. I invite you to browse their website and see all of the amazing reviews they've gotten and all the ways in which Magic Mind can help you not only overcome procrastination, but just overall become more productive. Magic Mind is offering listeners of 80/20 Productivity 20% off any order on the website of Magic Mind. Go to magicmind.com/80/20 productivity. That's magicmind.com/80/20 productivity, and use the discount code PRD20 for an extra 20% off. They're so sure you'll like it that if you don't, all you have to do is just let them know you didn't like it, and you get your money back 100%. And you don't even have to send the product back to the company. So really, there's zero risk involved. Give it a shot. Magicmind.com/80/20 productivity. Use the discount code PRD20 to get 20% off. Back to our conversation on procrastination, the procrastination equation. So now that we know what the procrastination equation is, thanks to the brilliant work of Dr. Steele, utility equals expectancy times value over delay times impulsiveness. What are some of the strategies we can use to alter these variables in our favor? Remember, we want expectancy and value to be high. We want delay and impulsiveness to be low so that utility can be high. Let's talk about strategies for improving expectancy. If you find out through some reflection and thought, which I invite you to do, by the way. This episode is not going to be very useful if you just listen to it or watch it and don't actually apply it to your own procrastination situation. So let's say from an expectancy standpoint, you realize after some reflection that, you know what, I'm procrastinating this particular task because the expectancy is low. My expectancy of success is low. The interventions are numerous, but one of the best interventions is to do one of two things. So you can either model or you can perform. So let's break those two things down. If you take a modeling approach to overcoming expectancy issues, this is based on the work of Dr. Bandura in self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the concept that you believe yourself to be able to do something. Hence you have high self-efficacy. And it makes perfect sense. If you believe you're able to do something, then your expectation of success will be higher. But not all of us have that belief especially not in every domain of life. So one way to overcome it is to model. What does this mean? You look for examples of people who have done the thing that you're trying to do and have been successful at it, and you model them as a way of overcoming your own let's just say low self-efficacy. So for the salesperson might go out and either put themselves in situations where they interact with successful salespeople. They learn how they do it, or they just learn that it is doable, it is possible. Maybe they attend conferences, maybe they start reading books about salespeople who have been successful, and they basically either model directly what those people are doing to increase their expectancy of success, or they at least retrain their minds to believe that success is possible and is achievable. Still on expectancy, the second way to overcome expectancy issues is to perform. right? So you can model, or you can just build evidence for yourself. If you're successful at the thing one time, two times, three times, your self-efficacy starts to go up. You start to believe that you can do it again. One thing that I find personally interesting for this particular intervention, or this particular strategy, is that it's actually possible to increase your expectancy in a completely different domain than the domain in which you had success. So for you, what is the task you are procrastinating? And have you identified that expectancy is the culprit? Can you model? Can you find people who have done it well and learn from them directly, or just use them as inspiration that it is possible? Or do you have victories? Do you have things you've done in the past that ways in which you've overcome odds in the past of expectancy? Can you draw on that to increase the value of E? All right. So let's talk about V next. V is value. And for value, remember, value can be tangible or intangible. And what you want to do is you want to, again, increase value. E times V. You want those two to be higher. One of the interventions that is recommended, again, let's look at it in terms of the strategies of intervention. My favorite strategy, both from the research and in real life, for overcoming challenges with value, is what the research paper calls impulse pairing. Now, remember, see that word impulse in there? We're not talking about impulse, right? We're not talking about impulse as part of the denominator. We're talking about value. But the strategy to helping with increasing value is impulse pairing. But let's say you find a task boring, but you're a person who values excitement. You value stimulation in your life, but that task is boring. Can you impulse pair? So can you find a way to complete the task in a way that is not boring? Interestingly, some people have overcome this by making the task more difficult. Right? So maybe you tell yourself, and this is not about waiting till the last moment, right? Which is the negative way this tends to express itself. If you say, you know what, I want to complete this task in record time. Let's say you gamify the task. Right? You say, usually this task should take me an hour. I want to finish this task in 40 minutes or 30 minutes. You'd be surprised how alert you become. All of a sudden, you get a lot of stimulation going. I use this a lot for tasks that I don't particularly enjoy. And so what I'll do is I'll use the Pomodoro technique. Some of you might be familiar with that. I'll set the timer and I'll just try to beat the timer. A task that I know should take like an hour, I'll try to do it in like 25 minutes. Often I don't succeed, but you know what? 25 minutes in, it's surprising how far along I am. Usually I'm about 80% there, because the stimulation of making the task more difficult and hence more interesting really works. Now, I've used the example of boring in this case, but there are many other ways. You might be a person who values social interactions. An example that's very pertinent is for students. They may not like studying, but they may like hanging out with friends. What if they had a study group that they got together, and the studying becomes maybe like 80% of what they do? They spend 80% of the time studying, maybe they spend another 20% of the time talking, chilling out, maybe playing a few games, but the studying is the bulk of what they do. Now all of a sudden, a task that the person would typically not want to do becomes desirable because they've impulse paired. They've paired it with the impulse that has higher value for them. Maybe you can find ways to achieve this, but the main takeaway is a very effective strategy for increasing value is to impulse pair. The next variable in the equation, now we're moving into the denominator, right? We want these to be low. While we want expectancy and value to be high, we want delay and impulsiveness to be low. So how can we work on delay? How can we make delay low? I mean, this one's pretty straightforward. Parkinson's law comes to mind here. Parkinson's law, in case you're not familiar with it, is I have a short video on it on here on YouTube here somewhere. But the main point is tasks will often expand to fill the time you allot to them. But the flip side of it is if you give yourself deadlines, if you shorten the feedback loop or you shorten the time you have to do something, the probability that you'll, at least if it's a delay issue, if the delay is a variable that's kind of sabotaging you, you can fix that by just giving yourself a deadline. I recommend you give yourself a deadline with a consequence. So for example, going back to value, part of what I was doing by setting the timer was not just increasing the difficulty and hence the stimulation of an otherwise boring task. I was also dealing with delay at the same time. And that's something you'll notice is a lot of the time, the strategies you use to overcome one variable or one element of the procrastination equation will often spill over into the others and help. As long as it's raising utility, it's all good. So delay, one of the best ways to overcome delay, if you've noticed that you are tending to put things off to the last minute because you think you have time, you feel like you have time, there's more time, just give yourself some deadlines in between. One way to do it is to give yourself milestone deadlines. So breaking down the task, and this is true as well, like the research has shown that goal setting and planning do help with procrastination. So if you give yourself firm deadlines, in milestone deadlines, for example, let's use the example of this podcast. There are steps. There's outlining, or there's idea generation. Usually there's outlining. Then there is setup. There's recording. There's editing. Instead of thinking about, podcast episode is due in 2 weeks, I can think I have to have 5 ideas by noon tomorrow. That just immediately shortens that delay. So the goal now is the ideas, not podcast episode in 2 weeks. When that's done, I need to have an outline by Tuesday afternoon. By doing it that way, you not only shorten the delay, you engage planning and you just get clarity. Again, I recommend you listen to the episode that I talked about reasons why you procrastinate that have nothing to do with laziness. These strategies show up there as well. So that's one aspect of overcoming. One strategy to overcome delay is just to eliminate it by having a plan, having milestones, and having those be the things you're working toward instead of the more distal goal of, say, the end of something. For the person who writes code, for example, you may segment the function of the code you're trying to write into certain milestones. For a manager who's working with staff, instead of saying, I want to achieve these metrics by a certain time, have in-between metrics that you push toward. And this is very good for team motivation as well. When the team is working toward immediate goals, they get that immediate feedback within a short amount of time. It's very, very good for overcoming team procrastination as well. So we've talked about E, we've talked about V, we've talked about D. Let's talk about I, impulsivity. One thing to keep in mind is that impulsivity, is pretty much, it's a big part of procrastination. And procrastination is kind of incomplete without impulsivity. And, one of the things that often comes up with people procrastinate is that they're often distracted by a lot of things, right? They want to work, the more difficult task is staring them in the face, but instead they find themselves working on or playing on something else as a form of impulse. So impulse control is incredibly important in overcoming procrastination. Viewed through the lens of the procrastination equation, impulse control becomes huge, especially when you consider delay, because you're more likely to delay something if you are impulsive. You're dealing with what's in the moment, what's in front of your face at the current time. So, impulse control. How do you strategize to help you overcome impulsiveness? The first question is, like we've been going through in the entire episode, is impulse control the problem? And how do you find that out? You can just look at your own history, watch your own behavior. If you're procrastinating a task because you keep finding more fun things to do instead of that task, then it's probably an impulse issue. And if that's the case, then these two fundamental strategies will help you. If you are procrastinating, on the other hand, if you're procrastinating, but you're not replacing what you're doing with more fun, as it were, things, you're not being impulsive, then it's probably something else. But let's assume that you've done the reflection and you figured out that, yeah, I am fairly impulsive. I pick the thing that's closest, right? Again, we see that relationship to delay, something that is either more immediate, more imminent, and usually more fun, i.e. higher value because I value fun. Maybe that thing is even easier, higher expectancy, right? So let's lay this out. A person, let's go back to the video game issue. A person has a difficult essay to write, a term paper to write, a student, or the person has their PlayStation or their video game right there with the TV in front of them. Expectancy for doing well in the term paper, 50-50. If they're really good students, maybe higher, but they really can't tell. It's a grade. They might do well, they may not do well. Expectancy for playing the game, maybe also 50-50, but if they really like the game and they're good at it, that could also skew. So you have that skill component there, or maybe the history component, how well they've done in the past. Now we have value. If they value fun and they don't think that essay is going to be fun, then the video game wins right away. What about delay? The term paper is not due for another 4 to 5 weeks, and there's no feedback loop in between. The game is right there. I can sit down right now and start playing the game, and I get feedback loops immediately from like the first couple of minutes, which is a feature that's built into those games on purpose, by the way. All of this put together, all these three numbers are ultimately dependent on, to a very large extent, I would say, on how sensitive I am to delay, how sensitive I am to putting things off, how impulsive I am. If I'm a very impulsive person, which correlates highly with procrastination, and it's not a bad thing, it's just something to understand about yourself or about myself. I know that I'm probably going to pick the impulsive, immediate pleasure of playing that game over the more difficult job or task of working on a term paper that's not due for another couple of weeks. I say all that because understanding that dynamic is going to be important for applying the strategies for overcoming impulsiveness or sensitivity to delay. And that strategy boils down to two concepts. Number one, stimulus control, and number two, automation. Let's talk about those two things briefly. Stimulus control is controlling the distractions around you. This is why there's a lot of research actually that backs up the concept of having an office, whether it's an office you go to, at the actual office, or a space that's carved out for work. This is why a lot of students, I know when I was in university, I used to study in the classroom, because the classroom is a place that has very controlled stimulus, and it's a place that I've associated with learning. I had associated with learning. It's also why I like having the blessing of having an office now, where when I'm in this office, it's very controlled for stimulus. I don't usually watch TV or watch like entertainment stuff in here, and that's to control stimulus. Sometimes you have to go to the extreme. You have to disable the option of stimulus if you know that you tend to be driven by impulse. So stimulus control is huge. Control your environment. It really helps to lower the demands on your willpower and your executive function if those options just aren't there. Turn your phone off or leave it in a different room. Control the environment in a way that just reduces sensory input. I read somewhere that many magnitudes over, I can't remember whether it was 100 or 1,000 times more stimulus these days than we used to, than was available to the average person, even as little as 30, 40 years ago. I think about all the distractions that are coming your way. A lot of it can be traced to this little device here, right? Maybe it's your cell phone, social media, so many things that could be distracting impacting you. And if you are already a person who has high impulsivity, which again, like I said, is not a bad thing. If you listen to the other episode on procrastination, it's actually a strategy for survival, but it just doesn't serve us very well in modern times. But if that's you, then stimulus control is going to be huge. Stimulus control. The second thing is automation or automaticity, which means that you try to decide as much as you can in advance. This is something I talk a lot about in my book. And I also have an episode where I talk about implementation intentions from the goal setting literature. And one of the reasons why this works is because it just takes the decision making out of it. You don't have to decide every single time to do something or not do it. If you've decided in advance and you have an automation set up, which we'll talk about in a second, then it just reduces the impulsivity. One good way to do this is to just have routines. Routines. Again, I recommend you listen to the episode on implementation intentions, but routines are powerful. They are powerful. When it is 7 a.m. on Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday, or Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, or whatever, I will be at the gym working on my full body resistance training. When it is 12 noon on Tuesday and Thursday, I will be outside jogging or working on my cardiovascular health. These kinds of routines that remove the need to decide over and over and over again can be very helpful for you if you find yourself to be impulsive. Now, setting up those routines and whether or not you follow through on them is its own beast entirely. But knowing that it is a strategy that can work makes it worthwhile for you to check out and, give it a shot. It might be the missing link for you. So remember those two things: stimulus control, manage your environment so that there are fewer distractions, and automation, setting up routines that are automatic, the ones that don't need you to decide over and over and over again when you will do the thing. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the episode. If you're watching this on YouTube, please feel free to leave some comments below. Which one of these 4 variables resonated the most with you for the task that you find yourself procrastinating, and how will you apply some of the strategies that we talked about here to help you overcome it? If you're listening to the podcast, leave a review, give me some feedback. I would love to hear from you. We make these podcasts and we kind of send them out there. It's always so encouraging when somebody says something back or leaves a review. It keeps me going as well. Increase the value of the podcast for me, right? Reduce the delay to feedback. I should stop now. Anyway, it's always fun. And like we always say on 80/20 productivity, it's not what you know that matters. It's what you do with what you know. Take care. Have a productive week. And I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.